So today we're going to talk about what MMO has the best economy. And in my opinion, it's EVE Online first, followed very closely by Albion Online, and a little bit more distantly followed by New World. Those three games stand out as a sandbox style economy, which is significantly more realistic than a theme park style MMO will ever be. Now, as we get into theme park MMOs, I'm going to give Fantasy XIV the first spot, followed closely by Guild Wars 2. And I won't go any further because I think there's a lot of MMOs out there that involve a market board. They involve the opportunity of players to buy things, to sell things, to interact, but they lack the kind of depth that would be required to describe the game as an economic simulation. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about EVE Online because I downloaded the game, I gave it a very, very brief play the tutorial sort of go, and I didn't really enjoy it. I looked at it, and I saw a game involving the darkness and expanse of space, and a lot of complex systems surrounding navigating that space, which is beautiful and very cool, and something I'm sure I could get into if I wanted to make that my only game, and devote myself to it as many people have described it, like a spreadsheet simulator. To me, MMOs have to be fun. And I don't think EVE Online quite falls into that category, at least for the average user. There's some people that, of course, will enjoy EVE Online profusely, and some people who will treat it like a second job. But for the average person who likes MMOs and wants a realistic economy, EVE Online may be too abstract with its space setting and too intense for a person who doesn't necessarily want to devote their life to it. Albion Online incorporates a lot of the same mechanics of sandbox open world economy that EVE does. But it does so in a lighter, more aesthetically pleasing and relatable fantasy setting. In Albion Online, the gathering is realistic in the sense that as you navigate around the world, you can interact with just about everything. There's trees all over the place, and you can gather from the trees. You can gather from the rocks. You can walk up to any body of water and fish. You can just walk around the world gathering resources. And that's very unique compared to a game like Final Fantasy XIV, for example, which certainly does have an economy, but it doesn't have the same type of accessibility to just wander around the world gathering resources and know that your resources, whatever you gather, whatever you get your hands on, have some economic value in the game. You can just go out and hack random trees in Albion Online, and you can sell those resources and make legitimate game currency by doing so. And you're not going to be selling to an NPC, you're going to be selling to another player who actually needs those resources and is willing to pay to get them, just like it would be in a real economy. And that leads me to my next point about Albion. Everything in the game that you're ever going to equip is player crafted. You can't go do a quest that the game sends you on and get something to wear that the game gives you. Other than the very, very first quest at the beginning of the game, which is essentially the tutorial that gives every new player a donkey, you're going to have to make everything you wear or buy it from someone else who has learned the crafting skill to create that item. You are going to get that extra layer of realism knowing that everything you have, somebody made. That's very critical to a realistic economy. And that's something that most MMOs don't fully implement because they make it safe. They guarantee you're going to have the equipment that you need to play the game, and if you get something player crafted or you sell something to another player, that's basically extra. That's something that sets Albion and EVE Online apart from other MMOs in a very distinct way. It's also something that separates them from New World, the new MMO which has tried to emulate some of those sandbox elements. The next point I'm going to make is about market localization. In Albion Online, every city you go to has its own marketplace. And every marketplace has its own prices, which are determined by supply and demand. So a city that is in the forest is going to naturally have more wood available for sale. And so the cost of wood in a forest city like Limhurst is going to be lower than it would be in perhaps a desert city where there isn't any wood beyond tier 1. Most other MMOs share a economy that does not create area-specific marketplaces. So you can go to any market board, and regardless of where you go, you're going to be able to see the market prices server-wide. The fact that Albion doesn't do this adds a level of depth and realism which is very unique to it and, again, EVE Online. And I don't know of any other games beyond these two which have that type of system. The server in Albion Online is very large. Every player that plays the game is going to be on the same server, in the same world. That means that the economy is quite balanced, because there's a lot of people participating in it. In a game like New World, we start to see problems of scale when the number of people playing on a server might fluctuate from a high of a couple thousand to a low of a couple hundred. We start to see imbalances which appear, and in some cases negatively impact gameplay, depending on what those items are. We start to see deflation of some items, and dramatic inflation for others. Ultimately, the fact that Albion and EVE Online share a single global server that all players engage with is very critical to part of why these games have very realistic economies. Full loot PvP is one of Albion's strengths, and depending on the player, it also could be a negative. Because when you go out and fight in the red or the black zones in Albion, if another player kills you, which they probably will, you'll lose everything you have. And that person who killed you is going to have your things. Beyond some of them, of course, which will break. that is something that some players enjoy and some players detest. There's a lot of imbalance between a weak player and a very experienced, long-term wealthy player. And these things can lead to a toxic community, an aggressive community, a player base that is divided between the haves and the have-nots. But the fact that it works in this way is very critical to why the economy works so well. In a theme park MMO, you can go out and you can do a dungeon or whatever it is you're doing in the game, and you're going to wind up maybe damaging your equipment and having to spend coin that the game gave you to repair it. But you're not going to lose it. And while that's nice for the player that doesn't lose their gear, it also guarantees that there's not going to be a persistent demand for that gear. Because a lot of the gear that people wear, they get from the game. And a lot of the gear that they get from crafting, they never lose. So outside of new players entering the community that need these items, or people that want to get them faster than the main story quest provides them, or something like that, it's easy to get to a point where demand for items plateaus. In Albion, it's a guarantee that everything you get is going to probably be destroyed one day, whether you lose it or you sell it and another player loses it. In theme park MMOs, currency is essentially printed out of thin air. It's added to the economy. And then, repair fees or transport fees, a lot of that money leaves the economy in the same way that it entered. It comes from the game to the player, it goes from the player back to the game, and stops existing. The currency doesn't necessarily trade from one player to another player in the way currency would move around a real economy. So, if I was going to describe the difference between a theme park economy and a sandbox economy, it essentially would be like the difference between a fish aquarium, which recycles its water, and you only add a little bit if evaporation occurs, versus the kitchen sink, where you have a steady stream of water coming out of the faucet, pouring into the sink, and you also have a drain that is persistently removing that currency from the economy. While both are functional from a play standpoint, what you really want, if you want a realistic economy, is an ecosystem. Something that feels like it is self-sustaining and self-enclosed. Albion does that better than any game I've seen, outside, again, of EVE Online, but I'm not going to focus on that heavily because the style of the game is so different from the first-person character perspective of a fantasy MMO that it really deserves its own category all to itself. I think Albion and Final Fantasy go very well together, because there's a lot of things that Albion Online is not. It's not going to be a game with a very supportive, friendly community that's focused on working together, because the dynamic of the game is all about players working to get themselves ahead instead of working together as part of a single large team. Final Fantasy XIV does a wonderful job of bringing its community together over a common story that everyone loves and enjoys together. Final Fantasy XIV has a wonderful cosmetics, home building, furniture crafting aspect of its game that Albion doesn't. Though Albion has a sense of property ownership in it, you can have an island, you can have items in your own personal chests, you can build buildings on your private island. It doesn't have the level of customization from a aesthetic, if you will, cute perspective that Final Fantasy XIV does. So if you want community, if you want society, if you want to be able to customize your character and customize your player-owned home in a really unique way, if you want to collect cool outfits and cool minions and be able to just make friends in the game, Final Fantasy XIV does a really great job of that. And Albion is probably not going to win any awards in that category. But if you want to log on and see what you can do to make some money, and imagine yourself in a rugged, savage land that's going to reward the rugged individualist or the person that works together to form a guild to fight, then the PvP in Albion is pretty cool. And the ability to engage in a realistic economy is really, really cool. I think the games are actually wonderful companions to each other. If you feel like a game like Final Fantasy XIV is lacking in economic realism, a game like Albion makes up for that. And the fact that Albion Online is available on a cell phone makes it that much better. On the flip side, if you feel like Albion Online is missing something, and you want a little bit more of that sense of friendly society, Final Fantasy XIV is a really good way to fill that gap. Finally, just to touch a little bit more on New World and Guild Wars 2, I would point out that New World tries to be some of what Albion Online is. And the fact that New World doesn't have full loot PvP and compensates for the lack of items being destroyed with a item salvage system instead. Among other things, like the fact you can't have more than 500,000 coin, and property taxes for a home are ridiculous. It still feels like a sandbox game. It feels in many ways like Albion Online with better graphics. It could even be more fun if you're a player who wants something a little bit more like a theme park without going all the way to the theme park category with a game like Final Fantasy. New World could be a good non-subscription alternative to Albion Online. Of course, it's a new game, and time will tell how successful that game is. On the other side of the boat, Guild Wars 2 is a good alternative to Final Fantasy XIV if you're looking for something that has the sense of community and society and character customization that also does not have a subscription. But if you take the question of whether it has a subscription or not out of the equation, I cannot recommend New World over Albion Online, nor could I recommend Guild Wars 2 over Final Fantasy XIV. So it really boils down to whether you want to play more than one game, or if you want to sink your whole life into just one title. And if you want to sink your life into just one title and you don't care about a fantasy theme at all, then EVE Online might be your thing. But if you want to play more than just one game that you're going to make your whole life, probably not EVE. If you want to pay a subscription, and you're okay with paying a subscription, and you want a good sandbox, realistic economy, and you also want a good society, social, story-driven game, then hands down, Albion Online for the economy, Final Fantasy XIV for the society. If you want something like that, but you don't want to pay money every month for subscriptions, Guild Wars 2 and New World are good considerations. The only other things I would take into consideration would be the high system requirements of New World, which could be fine or could be a negative to some, as well as its non-availability on mobile platforms. And I would also throw out the fact that while Final Fantasy XIV does allow people to cross between servers, it does have distinct servers. While Guild Wars 2 has a mega server, which is one specific way that Guild Wars 2 has an edge over Final Fantasy XIV, at least in terms of player-to-player accessibility. It also has a downside in that regard, because if you log on, you're not necessarily going to see all of the players that are in that space. The game will selectively show you whatever instance of the map you are in it chooses to, at random. It'll try to pair you with your friends, but ultimately, you could be playing with many, many people, but not actually see their characters in that space, unless you joined a party with them or something like that. Final Fantasy XIV feels a lot more real, because if someone on your server is online, and their character is standing there near you, you're going to see that character. Guild Wars 2 is not necessarily that way. So, I think it's pretty cool that if I said, meet me in this particular place, I wouldn't have to join a party in Final Fantasy XIV to see that person. I can just go to that place on that server, and I could meet that person there. Same thing for Albion Online, only it doesn't have multiple servers, so it's even easier to meet someone and to play with other people, because you're never going to ask, what server are you on in Albion? All you have to do is say, meet me by the castle next to Limhurst, and that person can meet you there, regardless of where in the world they are logging on from. And that's really, really awesome. So a lot of things to consider as you try to figure out what game you want to play. For me, my plan is to stay committed to Albion Online and Final Fantasy XIV, with some space left over for regular single-player RPG adventures that I enjoy, which are not MMOs. And beyond that, I'll be playing other games that have nothing to do with RPGs or MMOs. And as for all the games I don't necessarily log on to and play, doesn't necessarily mean I've quit them, but it's going to be more like once a week, if that, when I log on and see what's going on. And out of all of those games, the only ones that I really feel are worth a monthly subscription are Albion Online and Final Fantasy XIV. This will probably be our second video on the channel. Right now I'm just trying to get used to making videos and publishing content, and we'll work on getting better at the production value as time goes on. But thank you very much for watching if you have watched, and please subscribe and like the video. Jaliva out. Have a wonderful day.